Hey there, I'm Ari with the Tech Buyers Guru, and I've got another product here for review, and that is the Be Quiet Dark-Base Pro Revision 2 ATX case. This is a high-end case, especially if you're going by price. It comes in at a retail price around $270. Be Quiet is a German-based company known for, go figure, being quiet. They design a lot of PC components that are all based on minimizing sound. So that, of course, is the claim to fame of their highest end case, this being the Dark-Base Pro 900. Now, it has a ton of features that are all focused on making this as quiet as possible. I'm going to walk you through those. I'm also going to walk you through the process of building in this case, which I found to actually be fairly challenging. Now there are two reasons for that. It's not so much that it was built to be quiet. That doesn't really make it actually harder to build in. What makes it harder to build in, unfortunately, is that I believe that this is really a dated design, and that to compensate for the fact that this is really an older case, or that fundamentally this is an old case. Be Quiet has tacked on a number of very forward-looking features. These include RGB lighting, a Qi wireless phone charger, and USB Type-C. Now, in each of those cases, they work fine, but I felt that when building it, that a lot of these features basically got in the way of the building process, particularly the Qi charger and the LED lighting. I also found that one of the touted features of this case, which is really baffling to me, is that it can be inverted. So you can actually remove all of the components inside this case, and you can flip them so that the case would therefore be oriented this way. All right, so your motherboard would be showing on this side, your glass panel would be on this side, everything would be inverted, your video card would be flipped over. Now, there are benefits to running a PC in an inverted fashion, a 180-degree rotation, but I don't think there's an advantage to having a case that can do both, because the complexity of building in this case was just beyond anything I've seen in an ATX case, especially one of this size. This is a huge tower case, and yet it was really hard to fit a lot of these components in here. I'm going to go through the details in a step-by-step process. The other thing that I want to mention is, in terms of forward-looking features, it does have that PSU shroud. It's become very, very fashionable in cases. I think it's a great idea. It hides those cables. But again, this is really an older case in which this PSU shroud was added on after the fact. I could tell that right away because of the way that it was attached. First of all, you had to take it out to install the power supply, which is baffling. And then it actually really didn't fit very well. It was hard to find the screws. They were hidden in odd places. Clearly, those screws and attachment points were made after the fact. So I do have some serious concerns about the builder-friendly nature of this case, or lack thereof. It was the hardest ATX case I've ever used, and I've built in dozens of ATX cases. Now, with all that said, it is very quiet. It's actually running right now. I'm going to put up some benchmark numbers a little bit later. It absolutely hits the target in terms of providing a really, really quiet computing experience, even with high-end gear in here. I've got a Ryzen 7 2700X processor that's liquid-cooled with a Corsair H100i liquid cooler, and I have a GTX 1080 Ti video card in here that's also liquid cooled. Each of those radiators has its own associated noise, and yet this case is, I'm standing right next to it. There's dual radiators in here, lots of fans running, and it's really quiet. So Be Quiet, the company, nails quiet, the goal, but in the process kind of misses on a lot of other things. So let me step through the process and the challenges I had in building this PC, then I'll get to the benchmarks, and then I'll give you the conclusion. Be back in a sec. So the first thing I noticed at step one of the building process was that the vent for the power supply was about half the size of the power supply's fan. Typically, I like to orient my power supplies face down with the fan facing down towards the floor. But in this case, I really wasn't comfortable doing that because of how small this vent was. I decided I would flip the orientation of the EVGA power supply, and alas, I found I couldn't actually install it because the extension cord that Be Quiet provides is angled such that it would hit the side of the case, as you can see here. Well, I've encountered yet another serious design flaw in this case. I'm going to show it to you right here. There actually isn't enough clearance between the motherboard position and the top mount to install even a standard 240 millimeter liquid cooler. This is a Corsair H100i. This is pretty disappointing. Given how very tall this case is and how huge it is, I cannot install this cooler. Hits my motherboard heatsink right there. All right, there's no way for me to install this. It doesn't line up with the mounts up here, into the rails. I can't install this here. Now, I'm still trying to figure out if I can install it way up in front. And note that I have actually removed the optical drive bay here. That's why I have all this space. But again, those rails don't actually line up correctly. Like there's some gaps here where I actually need holes. So I have not yet figured out how I'm going to get this liquid cooler in here, but this is a crippling problem. From my point of view, this case was probably designed for air cooling, and then they kind of added those rails up at the top as an afterthought and didn't realize or didn't care that you couldn't actually install a liquid cooler up there. That is pretty bad. It's not the first time I've seen this. I've seen this from other manufacturers that market their cases with compatibility with 240 and 280 millimeter liquid coolers. But, you know, this is the biggest case in which I've seen this problem. All right, well, I did come up with a solution. I actually mounted the radiator above the chassis. So this is in the compartment where the top of the case will actually cover. But my radiator's outside the main chassis. You could not mount it inside the chassis. Pretty big problem. I just want to point out one more thing that I'm a little bit disappointed at. I thought this was kind of a neat feature that Be Quiet includes this little caddy that you can put in the middle of the PSU shroud to kind of show off your SSD. Now, of course, the high-end SSDs are all moving to the M2 form factor. I've got a Samsung, back in here, a Samsung M2 drive, a PCIe drive. But this is my 850 EVO, and I thought, well, as long as I have a 2.5-inch drive, I'm actually mounting two in this case, well, I'll try this out. Here's the problem. Be Quiet didn't include the countersunk screws that you needed to fit this into this tray and actually get the tray to sit into the shroud. So you can see how this is moving. That's because I've only been able to attach screws in the back. If I had attached screws in the front, once the SSD was attached to the tray wouldn't slide into the shroud. And also included in the box are these two LED strips. Now, this is a hard PCB. This is not a soft strip. Like most others I've used, or all others I've used. These Be Quiet branded even. Interesting. Comes with a 3M tape on the back. I have not located where these will fit yet. I'm a little bit surprised that Be Quiet didn't just have them pre-installed. To me, that feels kind of tacked on. You know, they come just like this, and you have to kind of wire them up. Every other case I've tested that has RGB lighting has, you know, the lighting pre-installed. You don't have to install it yourself. Maybe Be Quiet's thinking you don't want it. Maybe Be Quiet's thinking you're going to use your own. Who knows? But I'll have to figure out where to install these and where they could possibly fit. All right, I've installed the LED strips. I found really only two locations where they could fit, and just barely. Here it is at the front of the front, or at back of the front panel, I should say. You can see it's really all the way up at the top, so it's exactly the right length. Well, good on Be Quiet if they actually measured that and determined that that was the right length there. And then I have one way up here at the top of the case, shining down, and it certainly fit up there. I considered putting it along here on the PSU shroud, but really that would look kind of strange because that's not actually the bottom of the case. You can't mount it down here, which is a shame. That's where a lot of other cases where if they have pre-mounted LEDs, they're down here, but there's no space to do that here. And if you mounted it here, you just basically see these lights shining through in the middle of your side panel. It wouldn't look good. So there are really only two locations where those LED strips can go. You can see that front location. It's not bad up there. I just wish that, frankly, Be Quiet had pre-installed them, since there's really only two places you could put them, and actually maybe made them permanent. Like they're kind of just stuck on there with some tape. I'm a little concerned that they could fall off over time. They should really be permanently fixed, but they're not. And I'll show you how it all attaches in the back. So here's the back of the case. You have a PWM splitter and an RGB splitter. So that's kind of neat, pretty trick. You got two banks of fan controls, up to 8 fans, which is more than this case could fit. Maybe it could fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It could actually fit 8 fans if you fill every spot. So I've got 3 fans up front. I've moved the rear fan to the front and just left the rear spot empty. And then you have your LEDs. Now these actually have a lead that goes to the motherboard, as does the fan control. So that's pretty neat. So this board actually interfaces with the motherboard so that you can control your fans and your LEDs all via this splitter through headers on the motherboard. So that's a pretty trick, assuming it works. There's some switches on here, I guess silence and performance. That's assuming, I think that's only if you're actually using the fan control on the case, which I'm not going to do. All right, so that's it. That's the build in the back. You know, kind of a little bit of a cable mess. There wasn't quite as much of a tunnel here as I would have liked for cabling. And of course, I removed the hard drive caddy down there so I could tuck some cables in there. I've got my power supply mounted in there, of course. And there are some pretty cool rails here. This is a rail here and here where you can kind of tuck cables behind, so that's pretty neat. And last thing I'll show you is the front of the case. The fact that this case has this door, which kind of is a style that we saw in the early 2000s, you know, to allow access to a huge bank of optical drives, I think it's antiquated. I found that in use, this case, when I touched it, you know, often the door would kind of pop open, but wouldn't, you know, I'd have to kind of fumble with it to get this door closed. So I didn't love the fact that it had that pop open door. I don't think that's a forward looking feature. I think that's a backward looking feature. Another backward looking feature are the thumb screws on the glass panel. Now, when tempered glass cases first hit the market, say in 2016, all of them used this because that was the easiest way to retrofit existing designs with a glass panel. It's not the best way to make a tempered glass panel attached to a PC case. All of the high-end cases I've tested in the past year have used either a slide-on or a hinged case, a hinged case panel. No high-end case manufacturers are still using these 4 thumb screws. So that is just another sign that this case is really kind of behind the times. The last piece that I'm going to mention to you is on this side, we have this really weird vent. And I actually have it popped open because the attachment points inside actually interfere with the cables. So I couldn't actually slide this panel on with this vent closed. I had to pop it open to get its hinges out of the way of my motherboard cables and some of my other power supply cables. Now, I don't know when this design first appeared on the market. I'm guessing it was at least a decade ago. I don't see much use for this vent in a PC built in since 2010, frankly, and it's 2019 now. So I view this as kind of like an appendage, or literally like an appendix that we have. This is like the Dark Base Pro's appendix. I have no idea what it's doing here other than it gets in the way of the motherboard cables. Alright, I'm just going to go over the benchmarks here, starting with the idle test results. I'm comparing it to the Cooler Master H500P mesh, which is a completely different class of case. I get that. It just so happens that this was where I had all the same components installed previously, so I could come up with these benchmarks pretty easily. The Cooler Master H500P is a $160 case. Be Quiet is a $270 case, and the Be Quiet is quite a bit larger. And of course has its noise absorbing material. So it's a very different style of case. But here we see at idle, in terms of temperatures, our CPUs, both being liquid cooled, are identical. The GPU, also both being liquid cooled. The Be Quiet is 2 degrees hotter. So it's the first indication that something, there's a little bit less airflow, or a lot less airflow in there. And then you have noise. The Be Quiet Dark Base 900 does win here. It's 2 decibels quieter. So it's about as quiet as you're going to get a high-end system to be. Now the next benchmark I have is the CPU-Z built-in stress test. So this loads all 8 cores on the 2700X processor to about 100%. And what we see here is that the temperatures are actually quite similar. The CPU temp is 62 in the Cooler Master and 63 in the Be Quiet. Now keep in mind it's liquid cooled, so really the liquid cooler is doing a lot of the work here. Notice interestingly that the GPUs are pretty divergent here. Even though there's no load on that GPU, just the additional heat in the case and the lower airflow in the Be Quiet case does make that GPU a little hotter even when it's not doing anything. But look at the noise levels. 33 decibels. Measured from 6 inches in front of the case. The Be Quiet is essentially silent. I should note that that's just half a decibel higher than the H500P mesh is at idle. So having my CPU loaded to 100% on a liquid cooler in the Be Quiet case is barely any louder than sitting idle in the H500P. So Be Quiet hits the target here in terms of CPU noise. Let's get into a gaming benchmark. Okay, here I was playing a live multiplayer match in Battlefield 4. This loads the video card to 100% most of the time, and also loads the CPU quite a bit. What we see here is fairly divergent scores, again, as you might expect. The CPU is 3 degrees hotter in the Be Quiet case, and the GPU, which is loaded even higher, is 6 degrees hotter. Now, that is a very low temperature for a GPU. Keep that in mind. This is a liquid-cooled GTX 1080 Ti. So that 6-degree difference is pretty significant. If you had air-cooled cards, that would probably grow quite a bit, where the liquid cooler isn't able to compensate for the lower airflow in the case. With that said, even with those 2 liquid-cooled components and the pumps and working their hearts out, look at how quiet the Be Quiet case is. 36 decibels, full gaming load. There's no doubt that this case hits the target in terms of really running quietly, but that's the only target it hits. It's too big for the parts that the components can fit. It's way too hard to build in. It's too expensive for the performance you get. And too many of the features on it seem like they're just outdated. This case needs not like an update, it needs to be scrapped. That doesn't mean that there aren't good ideas in this case. That doesn't mean it's not a beautiful case. It actually is. I think it's one of the best looking cases on the market. It's very aesthetically pleasing. So go from the outside in. Use the same outside design motif, Be Quiet, but totally gut the inside. Like you were building a new house, but keeping that classic style. I think this style definitely appeals to people. It's a very professional looking case. I think a lot of other companies would really try to emulate this and not get it, because it's hard to get a really good looking case that doesn't look, well, boring, frankly. And this does not look boring. I think this is actually a really classy looking, interesting looking, high-end case. But everything inside has to go. So, with that said, the performance, the thermal performance was decent. It wasn't great. In terms of noise, it's fantastic. but the build process means I dropped it a full point, and some of the antiquated features on it, like the thumb screws, like this pop open door, like the vent on the side, I drop another point. I give this case 3.5 out of 5 stars. If you really like the style and you really want a quiet case and you're not that concerned about performance and you are an experienced PC builder, then go for it. It's not cheap, but it is high quality. But for everybody else, I think there are newer, better cases out there. If you need a quiet case, you can probably find a case that's nearly this quiet, that's a whole lot easier to build in and a whole lot cheaper too. So, with that, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.